The 64th floor of the Reid Technologies Tower buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Alexander Reid stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, absently swirling a cup of now cold coffee while studying the Seattle skyline. At 42, he had everything money could buy: the fastest-growing tech company in the Pacific Northwest, a penthouse that graced architectural magazines, and a net worth that made headlines every quarter. But something felt off today. The intercom on his desk crackled to life. Mr. Reid, his assistant's voice, carried an unusual note of uncertainty. There's a situation in the lobby." Alexander raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of his coffee before pressing the intercom button. "What kind of situation, Janet?" "A boy, sir. Security can't seem to handle him." "A boy?" Alexander set down his cup, frowning. "What do you mean, handle him?" "He's demanding to see you. Says he won't leave until he does. He's been here for 2 hours, and neither security nor child services can get him to budge. He's very determined." Something in Janet's voice made Alexander pause. In 15 years, he'd never heard her sound quite so rattled. "Send him up." "Sir, are you sure that's—" "Send him up, Janet." 5 minutes later, the elegant wooden doors to his office swung open. Alexander turned, expecting, well, he wasn't sure what he expected. But the sight before him made his coffee cup slip from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the polished floor. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. He wore a slightly oversized backpack and a determined expression that seemed at odds with his navy blue school uniform. But it was his face, those eyes, that particular set of the jaw that made Alexander's world tilt sideways. It was like looking at an old photograph of himself. "Security said I couldn't come up," the boy announced, his chin lifted in a gesture so familiar it made Alexander's chest ache. "But I told them they'd have to arrest me to make me leave. I didn't think they'd actually arrest a kid, and I was right." Alexander found himself sinking into his chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. Who are you?" "My name is Marcus Chen." The boy took a step forward, his sneakers leaving slight scuff marks on the immaculate floor. "And my mom says you're my father." The words hung in the air like suspended particles of dust, catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Alexander's mind raced through a decade of memories, landing with brutal clarity on one particular night: a celebration, a beautiful musician with talented fingers and laughing eyes, a connection that felt electric but temporary. Sarah Chen, the pianist at his company's first major product launch. That's impossible," Alexander managed, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. The proof was standing right in front of him, written in every feature of the boy's face. Marcus pulled off his backpack and unzipped it with deliberate movements. "Mom said I shouldn't look for you. Said you had your own life and made your choice a long time ago." He extracted a folder and placed it carefully on Alexander's desk. "But I'm good with computers, really good." And once I started looking, he shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both apology and defiance. "It wasn't that hard to find you." Alexander stared at the folder, then at the boy, his son, feeling like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Does your mother know you're here?" A flicker of guilt crossed Marcus's face. "She thinks I'm at coding club, which isn't exactly a lie. I mean, this building probably has more code being written in it right now than my whole school." He gestured at the sleek office around them. "But no, she doesn't know." Behind them, Janet appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. "Sir, I've called security." "No," Alexander said sharply, surprising himself with the force of his response. "No security. It's fine." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Marcus, please sit down." The boy settled into one of the leather chairs across from Alexander's desk, his feet barely touching the ground. In the morning light, the resemblance was even more striking: the same dark hair, the same analytical gaze that had helped Alexander build his empire. "I have questions," Marcus said simply. Alexander looked at his son. There was no point denying it now, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his world begin to crumble. "I imagine you do," he replied softly. "I think I have quite a few myself. 10 years earlier." The Space Needle glowed against the Seattle night sky as champagne flowed freely in the observation deck's private event space. Alexander Reid, barely 32 but already making waves in the tech industry, watched his employees celebrate with a sense of surreal satisfaction. Their first major product launch had exceeded all expectations. The stock had jumped 40% in a single day, and the tech blogs were already calling Reid Technologies the next big thing. He loosened his tie, still unused to wearing one. Just 3 years ago, he'd been coding in his garage, living on ramen and dreams. Now here he was, hosting a launch party at one of Seattle's most iconic venues, with investors and tech journalists mingling with his team. That's when he first heard the piano. The melody cut through the ambient chatter, something classical but with an unexpected jazz undertone. Alexander found himself drawn to the sound, weaving through the crowd until he reached the baby grand piano tucked into the corner of the space. Sarah Chen's fingers danced across the keys with practiced precision, but it was her expression that caught his attention. Eyes closed, slight smile playing at her lips, completely lost in the music. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant knot, exposing the graceful line of her neck as she swayed with the rhythm. As if sensing his presence, she opened her eyes, meeting his gaze without missing a note. Any request she asked, her fingers never stopping their dance across the keys. Something that matches how this night feels, Alexander replied, leaning against the piano. Sarah tilted her head, studying him for a moment. Then, the melody shifted, morphing into something triumphant yet questioning, like standing on the edge of a cliff and deciding to fly. "How's that?" "Perfect," he breathed, mesmerized by both the music and its creator. "Did you just compose that?" "Sometimes the moment needs its own soundtrack," she smiled, and something in Alexander's chest tightened. "I'm Sarah." "Alexander. Though I suppose you knew that, being hired for my party and all." "Actually, I'm just filling in for someone else." "Lucky coincidence. I'd say the music softened, becoming more intimate. Congratulations, by the way. I heard about the launch. Quite impressive for someone so young," says the woman who just composed a piece on the spot. Alexander countered, finding himself drawn closer to the piano. "Are you always this talented, or is it just for special occasions?" Sarah laughed, the sound blending perfectly with the notes she played. "I save my best improvisation for tech billionaires who actually notice the music instead of treating it like expensive background noise." "Not a billionaire yet," Alexander corrected. "Give me time." "Ambitious and appreciates music. Interesting combination." The party swirled around them, but Alexander barely noticed. They talked as Sarah played about music, technology, their dreams. She was working on her master's in musical composition, teaching piano on the side. He told her about his years of coding, about the moment he realized his algorithm could change everything. "Dance with me?" he asked when she finally finished playing, another musician taking her place. The night became a blur of perfect moments. Dancing under the city lights, stealing away to the observation deck to look at the stars, sharing whispered conversations in quiet corners. Sarah's laughter, the way her hand felt in his, the spark of recognition when she understood one of his tech jokes. They ended up at his penthouse, the city spread out below them like a blanket of stars. Sarah ran her fingers over his baby grand piano, an impulse purchase he'd never learned to play. "This is wasted on you," she teased, sitting down and playing a few notes. "All this beautiful potential, just gathering dust." "But maybe you could teach me," Alexander suggested, sitting beside her on the bench. "Maybe I could," she whispered, and then they were kissing, the piano forgotten. The morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Alexander woke to find Sarah already dressed, gathering her things. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, propping himself up on one elbow. "Early class to teach," she explained, slipping on her shoes. "Besides, I think we both know what this was." Alexander nodded, ignoring the small voice in his head that suggested maybe it could be more. He was on the verge of something huge with his company. Relationships were complicated, messy. This had been perfect precisely because it was temporary. "Let me call you a car," at least he offered, reaching for his phone. "I've already called one." Sarah paused at the door, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. "Good luck with everything, Alexander. I hope you find what you're looking for." "You too," he replied, already checking his emails. "And thanks for everything." The door clicked shut softly behind her. Alexander had a board meeting in 2 hours, and the market was opening soon. By the time he'd showered and dressed, the night felt like a dream, beautiful but insubstantial, not meant to last in the harsh light of day. He never expected to see Sarah Chen again. He certainly never expected that brief encounter to create a new life, one that would walk into his office a decade later with his eyes and his determination, demanding answers to questions he'd never thought to ask himself. Sitting across from Marcus now, Alexander felt the weight of that casual goodbye, that easy dismissal of something that might have been more. How many moments like that had he let slip away, too focused on the next big thing, the next milestone, the next achievement? "Tell me about my mum," Marcus said, breaking into his thoughts. What was she like back then? Alexander looked at his son. There was no denying that now, and for the first time in years, he let himself remember that night in perfect detail. "She was magical," he said softly. "And I was a fool." Sarah Chen sat alone in her tiny studio apartment, staring at the two pink lines that had just changed everything. Outside, Seattle's perpetual rain tapped against the window, providing a somber soundtrack to her racing thoughts. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, still flat, but now holding an impossible secret. 6 weeks had passed since that night at the Space Needle. 6 weeks since she'd walked away from Alexander Reid's penthouse, telling herself it was just another beautiful memory to tuck away. Now, those memories took on a different weight entirely. She picked up her phone, Alexander's number still stored in her contacts. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she set it back down. The morning after their night together, she'd seen the news about Reid Technologies' latest venture capital round $50 million in funding. There had been pictures of Alexander at the signing, looking every inch the focused tech entrepreneur, no trace of the man who'd talked about stars and music just hours before. "He's building an empire," she whispered to her still flat stomach, "and we will build something different." The decision, once made, gave her a strange sense of peace. She would do this on her own terms, without complications or obligations, without disrupting anyone else's carefully constructed plans. Months passed, and Sarah adapted. She took on more piano students, working until her 8th month of pregnancy. Her small but loyal client base kept her afloat, and her mother, though disappointed about the circumstances, helped her prepare for the baby. She turned her tiny living room into a teaching space, the baby's crib tucked carefully behind a decorative screen. Marcus arrived on a spring morning, screaming his arrival with healthy lungs and grabbing onto her finger with surprising strength. When the nurse placed him in her arms, Sarah saw Alexander immediately, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intense gaze. But as she held her son, those features became uniquely Marcus, and she fell in love all over again. She learned to balance teaching and motherhood, playing lullabies on her upright piano with Marcus strapped to her chest. Her students adapted to the baby's presence, some even bringing him small gifts. The elderly Mrs. Watson from down the hall would watch him during evening lessons, declaring him the most serious baby I've ever met. As Marcus grew, so did their little world. Sarah took a part-time position at a local music school, offering stability and health insurance. She watched her son develop his own personality, curious, determined, with an analytical mind that reminded her so much of his father. By age 5, while other kids were playing with toys, Marcus was taking apart old computers and putting them back together. "Mummy," he asked one evening when he was 7, looking up from a circuit board he'd been examining, "how come I don't have a dad like Tommy and Eva?" Sarah's fingers stilled on the piano keys. She'd been preparing for this question, but it still caught her off guard. "You have a father," she said carefully. "He's just not part of our family." "Is he dead?" "No, honey. He's alive. He's very successful. But sometimes grown-ups make choices about their lives, and those choices mean they take different paths." Marcus considered this with the same intense focus he gave to his computer projects. "Did he know about me?" "No," Sarah answered honestly. "I made a choice too, Marcus. I chose our path." She watched her son process this information, his young mind working through the implications. "Is he good with computers like me?" Sarah smiled softly. "Yes, very good. That's actually how he became successful." This seemed to satisfy Marcus for the moment, but Sarah noticed changes after that conversation. He spent more time on the computer, and she occasionally caught him searching news websites. She knew her bright, resourceful boy would eventually put the pieces together. Part of her dreaded that day, another part knew it was inevitable. One morning, as she prepared for her first student of the day, she found Marcus's notebook open on the kitchen table. In his neat handwriting was a list. 1. Reid Technologies. 2. Alexander Reid. 3. Space Needle Party. 4. Piano Performance. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her son had inherited more than just his father's looks and technical aptitude, he had Alexander's determination too. She knew then that keeping them apart wouldn't last forever. Marcus would find his way to the truth, just as surely as raindrops found their way to the ground. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Marcus sat cross-legged on his bed, surrounded by sticky notes and printouts, his laptop balanced carefully on his knees. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face as his fingers flew across the keyboard, each click bringing him closer to the truth he sought. He'd started small. A simple Google search for Alexander Reid had yielded thousands of results. Tech magazines called him a visionary. Business journals praised his innovation. Social media painted him as Seattle's most eligible bachelor. But Marcus wasn't interested in what the world thought of Alexander Reid. He wanted to know who his father really was. Late at night, while his mum taught her last piano lesson of the day, Marcus pieced together the puzzle. He created a timeline on his wall, hidden behind his Star Wars poster. The Space Needle Party where his parents met, Reid Technologies' major launches, his own birthday. Each data thread in a tapestry he was slowly weaving together. "You're just like him," his mum had said once, watching him debug a simple program he'd written. At the time he'd beamed with pride. Now those words took on new meaning. The final piece clicked into place when he found an article about the Space Needle celebration. There, in a grainy photo at the bottom, he spotted his mother at the piano. She looked younger, but her smile was the same one she wore when playing his favorite pieces. In the background, partially blurred, stood Alexander Reid, watching her with an expression Marcus couldn't quite decode. Planning the meeting took 2 weeks of careful preparation. He mapped bus routes from his school to the Reid Technologies Tower, timing each potential journey. He studied the company's public floor plans, available online due to their commitment to transparency. He even created a small program to track his mum's teaching schedule, ensuring she wouldn't discover his absence. The morning of his planned encounter, Marcus stood before his mirror, adjusting his school uniform with trembling fingers. He'd chosen it deliberately. Who would question a kid in a private school uniform? Besides, it made him look older, more serious, more like someone who deserved answers. "Your lunch is packed," his mum called from the kitchen. "Don't forget you have coding club after school." Marcus felt a twinge of guilt at the lie. He'd told her about the new after-school program weeks ago, building a foundation for this day. "Thanks, Mum. Love you." He hugged her extra tight that morning, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and sheet music that always clung to her clothes. For a moment he almost confessed everything. But then he remembered the sadness that flickered across her face whenever she thought he wasn't looking, the way she changed the subject when he asked about his father, the years of unanswered questions. The bus ride downtown felt eternal. Marcus clutched his backpack, containing everything he thought he might need: his folder of research, a water bottle, his emergency phone, and his life savings of $67. Each stop brought him closer to the gleaming tower he'd seen so often in photos. Standing before the Reid Technologies building, Marcus felt suddenly small. The glass and steel structure stretched toward the clouds like a modern-day castle. People in expensive suits streamed past him, too busy with their own lives to notice a 10-year-old boy having second thoughts. "Come on, Marcus," he whispered to himself, squaring his shoulders. "You've coded harder problems than this." He took a deep breath and pushed through the revolving doors, heading straight for the security desk. The guard looked up, bored. "Can I help you?" Marcus summoned every ounce of courage he possessed, channeling what he imagined his father might sound like in a business meeting. "I need to see Alexander Reid. It's important." "Sure," kid, the guard chuckled. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Marcus replied, lifting his chin. "But I'm his son." The DNA test results lay on Alexander's desk like a live wire, humming with implications. 99.99% probability of paternity. The clinical language couldn't mask the earthquake. It represented the complete reshaping of his carefully constructed world. Marcus sat in the conference room next door, working on coding exercises Alexander had given him to stay occupied. Even through the glass walls, the resemblance was uncanny. The way the boy's brow furrowed in concentration, The slight tilt of his head when solving a problem, it was like watching a ghost of his younger self. Sir Janet's voice crackled through the intercom. "MS, Chen is here." Alexander's throat tightened. "Send her in." Sarah burst through the door like a summer storm. All contained fury and fierce protection. 10 years had added subtle lines around her eyes, but she moved with the same grace he remembered, though now it was tempered with maternal steel. "Marcus," she called out, rushing toward the conference room. "He's fine," Alexander said quickly, stepping between her and the door. "He's just working on some programming." But the slap caught him off guard, more shocking than painful. Programming, Sarah's voice trembled. "My 10-year-old son disappears. I get a call from Reid Technologies saying he's here and you've got him doing programming exercises." Mum, Marcus appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "I'm okay. I had to know." Sarah gathered him into her arms, holding him tight before pulling back to examine his face. "Do you have any idea how worried I was? The school called when you missed afternoon classes." I thought her voice broke. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, "but look, I found him. And I was right, wasn't I? He is my father." The word father hung in the air between them all. Alexander moved to his desk, picking up the DNA results. "Perhaps we should all sit down." "There's nothing to discuss," Sarah said sharply. "Marcus, get your things. We're leaving." "Actually," Alexander said quietly, "I think there's quite a lot to discuss." He held out the test results. "Starting with this." Sarah stared at the paper but didn't take it. "I never asked you for anything." "Maybe that's part of the problem." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Marcus had made earlier that day. "You never gave me the chance to choose." "Choose?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The man I knew back then chose stock prices over breakfast conversation, chose conference calls over second dates. You made your choices very clear." Marcus looked between them, his young face serious. "But he didn't know about me. That wasn't his choice." "No," Alexander agreed softly. "It wasn't." He turned to Sarah. "You should have told me." "Would it have made a difference?" Sarah challenged. "Would you have traded your empire building for midnight feedings? Parent-teacher conferences? Piano recitals?" "Yes," Alexander said, surprising himself with the force of his conviction. "Or no, I don't know. But I deserved the chance to find out." He walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd helped shape. "Do you know what I was doing when Marcus walked into my office? Reading quarterly projections, like I do every morning, like I've done every morning for the past decade, building this." He gestured at the office around them, "this monument to success. And in one moment, this boy, our boy, made me question every choice I've ever made." "I'm really good at computers," Marcus offered into the heavy silence. "Like you." Alexander turned back, seeing them both, the woman he'd let slip away, the son he'd never known he had. "He has your smile," though, he said to Sarah, "and apparently your talent for dramatic entrances." A reluctant laugh escaped Sarah. "He has his own talent for those." She finally sat down, pulling Marcus close. "I thought I was protecting him, protecting myself. Maybe I was wrong." "We were both wrong," Alexander said. But maybe he looked at Marcus, seeing all the missed years written in his young face, all the possibilities still waiting in his future. "Maybe we can try to make it right." Marcus straightened in his chair. "I have a piano recital next week," he said. "I'm playing that piece you played the night you met. Mom taught it to me." Alexander met Sarah's eyes over their son's head, seeing in them the same mix of fear and hope he felt. "I'd like to be there," he said softly. "If you'll let me." Sarah took a deep breath. "It's time we all faced the music," she said finally. "Together." The piano recital hall buzzed with nervous energy as young performers adjusted their bow ties and smoothed their dresses. Alexander sat in the third row, a program clutched too tightly in his hands, feeling distinctly out of place among the other parents who all seemed to know exactly when to clap and how to act. When Marcus took the stage, Alexander held his breath. The boy sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench just so, and began to play. The familiar melody, the one Sarah had improvised the night they met, filled the hall, but with something new added. Marcus had woven in his own variations, threading contemporary elements through the classical framework. It was the perfect bridge between past and present, just like Marcus himself. After the performance, Alexander approached them awkwardly, holding a bouquet that suddenly seemed inadequate. That was incredible, he managed. The rhythm in the middle section was a little off, Marcus critiqued himself, but he was beaming. Mum says I rush when I'm nervous. You played it beautifully, Sarah assured him, then added reluctantly, would you like to join us for ice cream? It's our post-recital tradition. That evening marked the beginning of their cautious dance toward something resembling family. Alexander learned to navigate this new territory with small steps. He started by setting up a weekly coding session with Marcus, teaching him the foundations of software development while learning about his son's life in return. See, if you structure the algorithm this way, Alexander explained one afternoon, pointing to the laptop screen they shared, it processes the data more efficiently. Like how Mum teaches me to practice difficult passages in a piece slowly first, Marcus observed, building the foundation before adding speed. Alexander smiled, constantly amazed by how his son bridged their two worlds. Exactly, you get that insight from your mother. Sarah remained cautious, watching their growing bond with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She sat in on their first few coding sessions, ostensibly reading or grading papers, but Alexander caught her subtle smiles at their shared enthusiasm. One evening, after Marcus had solved a particularly challenging programming problem, Alexander gathered his courage. I'd like to have you both over for dinner, he said. I've been taking cooking classes. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You cook now? I'm learning, Alexander admitted. Turns out running a tech empire doesn't actually require missing out on all the important things in life. I just thought it did. Marcus looked between them hopefully. Can we, Mum? He has a piano. A real grand piano. Sarah's resistance softened at her son's excitement. All right, but no business calls during dinner. The evening of the dinner, Alexander's usually pristine penthouse was a mess of cooking attempts and nervous energy. He'd simplified his original ambitious menu to pasta, remembering how Sarah had once mentioned it was Marcus's favorite. When they arrived, Marcus made a beeline for the piano, while Sarah wandered to the windows, looking out at the same view she'd seen a decade ago. You kept it, she noted, gesturing to the piano. I never could bring myself to get rid of it, Alexander admitted, joining her at the window. Maybe some part of me was waiting. Mum, Marcus called out. Come see. The acoustics in here are amazing. He played a few notes, letting them ring through the space. They gathered around the dining table, the city lights twinkling below them. The pasta was slightly overcooked, the garlic bread a little too brown, but none of that seemed to matter. Marcus chatted about school, his latest coding projects, his music theory classes. Sarah gradually relaxed, sharing stories about her students and her recent appointment as the music school's director. Alexander watched them both, his heart full of an unfamiliar emotion. Here, in this space where he'd spent countless nights alone reviewing reports and projections, his son's laughter echoed off the walls, and Sarah's eyes sparkled in the candlelight. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, twirling pasta on his fork, some compounds become stronger when you break and remake their bonds. We learned about it in science class. Sarah and Alexander exchanged glances, both struck by their son's accidental wisdom. Sometimes, it seemed, the most precious things in life required breaking before they could be rebuilt into something stronger. 6 months after the first family dinner, Alexander stood before his board of directors, presenting a proposal unlike any they'd seen before. The Reid Foundation for Music and Technology, he announced, clicking to a slide showing children working with computers while others practiced instruments. A program combining STEM education with musical training for underprivileged youth. He caught sight of Marcus sitting quietly in the back of the boardroom, permitted to attend his first meeting. The boy gave him a subtle thumbs up, wearing a miniature version of Alexander's signature navy suit. But the Roy One board member began. He's measured in more than dollars, Alexander interrupted firmly. Though I've included projected community impact metrics in your packets. This initiative isn't just about corporate responsibility, it's about transformation. He knew something about transformation now. His calendar, once filled with back-to-back meetings, now held sacred spaces: Marcus's coding lessons, family dinners, piano recitals. His assistant had standing instructions that these times were inviolable, no matter what tech emergency arose. The board approved the initiative, perhaps more surprised by Alexander's newfound passion than the proposal itself. As the room cleared, Marcus bounded forward. Does this mean we can start the summer program? As soon as your mother finalizes the curriculum, Alexander smiled. Speaking of which, we should head over to the music school. They found Sarah in her office, surrounded by sheet music and grant applications. The past months had softened her edges when it came to Alexander, though she maintained a careful distance. But today, her smile was warm as they entered. The board approved it, Alexander announced. Sarah's eyes lit up. All of it. Even the recording studio. Though I still think we should add a full programming lab. One step at a time, Sarah laughed, a sound that still made Alexander's heart skip. We need to balance both sides, technology and music. Like someone else I know, she ruffled Marcus's hair affectionately. Marcus ducked away, trying to maintain his professional appearance. Can I show Dad my new composition? The one that uses computer-generated accompaniment. But the word Dad still felt new, precious. Alexander had earned it gradually, through months of showing up, of listening, of learning to be present in ways his younger self never understood. Actually, Sarah said, gathering her things, why don't we all go to dinner first? Marcus has something to tell you. Over pizza, Alexander had learned that some occasions called for simple pleasures. Marcus could barely contain his excitement. I got accepted into the advanced computing program at school, and he glanced at his mother for permission. I'm playing at the City Youth Symphony next month. Both your talents, Sarah said softly, looking at Alexander. But the heart, that's all his own. Later that evening, they gathered around the grand piano in Alexander's penthouse, no longer a showpiece, but a well-used family instrument. Marcus played his new composition, a piece that seamlessly blended classical structure with digital elements. Sarah offered technical suggestions while Alexander listened in wonder to the way his son bridged their separate worlds. As the music filled the space, Alexander reflected on the past year. He'd spent his life pursuing success, thinking it meant stock prices and market share. Now he understood that true success was in these moments: his son's music, Sarah's gentle corrections, the way they'd built something new from the fragments of what might have been. You know, he said when Marcus finished playing, some of the best code I've ever written came from mistakes. From going back and fixing what wasn't working. Sarah met his eyes over their son's head. Some of the best music comes from improvisation. From letting go of the original plan. Marcus looked between them, wise beyond his years. And sometimes, he added, the best things in life come from both. Outside, the Seattle skyline glittered, the same view that had witnessed their first meeting. But now it watched over something far more precious: a family finding its harmony, one careful note at a time. 1 year later, the benefit concert for the Reid Foundation for Music and Technology packed the Benaroya Hall to capacity. On stage, Marcus Reid Chen sat at the grand piano, his presence commanding despite his young age. Behind him, a digital display showed waves of code transforming into musical notes as he played a program he'd written himself, blending his two inheritances into something entirely new. In the front row, Alexander reached for Sarah's hand as their son began to play. She squeezed back, their shared pride transcending the careful boundaries they still maintained. They weren't a conventional family. Sarah and Alexander had chosen to remain friends, recognizing that some love stories were meant to create something beautiful without ending in romance, but they had found their own rhythm, their own way of being a family. Marcus's music soared through the hall, the same piece from that first night at the Space Needle, but transformed. Like them, it had grown into something richer, deeper, more complex. A testament to the power of second chances and the unexpected ways love could reshape a life. Alexander looked at his son, then at Sarah, and finally understood some fortunes couldn't be measured in dollars, and some investments paid dividends in moments like these: pure, precious, and perfectly imperfect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional family stories that remind us of the power of love and second chances. Share in the comments when has forgiveness changed your life. Have you ever experienced an unexpected reunion that transformed your world? Coming up next week, the old diary in the attic. When a young woman inherits her grandmother's house, she discovers a secret that spans 3 generations. You won't want to miss this tale of mystery, romance, and family bonds. Remember to ring that notification bell to catch all our upcoming stories of love, redemption, and the beautiful surprises life has in store.